No. I don't have to.
It's to Steve, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. You said something about, if you don't go out to anybody, who comes to you, it's been powerful and who are people, with resources and who can access that kind of stuff. But it struck me that often it's not the powerful that come in our direction because actually they don't want to hear some of what it is we're trying to say. I mean, certainly in my field, which is health service research, some of what's coming out from the research is actually very different from what the sort of prevailing ideology is in terms of how services should be organised. And so I think powerful will sometimes come to you, but maybe if they want to use the research in a very sort of political kind of way. So I think he can work both ways really. But I think some of the reasons why perhaps people don't come to us are things like timescales. Politicians often have very tight timescales and they don't want to wait 2-3 years for a piece of empirical research. And they're not necessarily sure that it's going to go in the direction they want it to, all those kind of reasons. And I imagine the same probably applies on the social psychology side.
I think you're completely right on both counts. I mean, the first thing is, again, if you want to affect public policy, you've got to be sanguine about it. I remember years ago, my first research was on delinquency. In fact, it was delinquency in the back of Dundee in the early 80s, and whatever was lacking in the back of Dundee in the early 80s, delinquency was not part of it. I mean, it was there were real issues. And I remember talking to the Home Office, and it was at the time of Conservative government and going through one of these periodic, we need to be tough on offenders. Short, sharp shock, it was talked about then. Now, the Home Office had done research, and they knew that these more punitive regimes, right, actually had no effect at all. They didn't deter people, they made people fitter. Actually, what the young kids really hated was the soft stuff, the psychology, having to talk about their issues. They didn't like. Having to go on runs, didn't have any issue at all. However, despite the fact they had the research that this wouldn't work, for the sake of a standing ovation at the Tory party conference, the short, sharp shock was implemented. So however good your research is, you've got to know that sometimes it's going to be overridden by political concerns. And if you give up because of that, well, there's no point even trying. You've got to be sanguine about it and to know. I mean, to know that there are other considerations. Politics, after all, is politics. So I think that's a really important point. And it's just got to be, as I say, you've got to roll with the punches just a little bit. And timescale, actually, the timescale issue is the most interesting issue because that's precisely the biggest difficulty of all in terms of having any impact. Partly because the Home Office on the whole for research will fund on a yearly basis. They don't know what's going to happen next year, so they can't give you research that lasts longer. And on the whole, what they want quick fixes to precise questions rather than a deeper understanding of the phenomenon which will lead to changes that might endure over time. And precisely the language of time and the assumptions about time and how long things will take, I think that's an absolutely central issue.
Although I think the other perspective that people sometimes have is that you can if you can build relationships with policymakers and you can sort of drip over time, and something which is maybe not current at the moment in terms of the policy might resurface 5 years later. I mean, I think you have to have a long view, and I'm quite I sort of want things to happen yesterday really, and I find it quite difficult to imagine that it might have an impact in 15 years time. But I think in practice, things often do. There's a sort of drip and relationship building that has to go on.
The way I've seen things is, so for instance, the work with the police on crowds. Within any institution, there's going to be, not exactly conflict, but there's going to be debate. There are going to be different people with different views. And quite often what happens is somebody with a particular perspective brings you in to give credibility to their point of view. So it's not as if you're saying anything that they didn't think already. You are legitimating one voice amongst many. And so the corollary of that is, and that's why I think it's worth rolling with the punches. Yes, temporarily, the political climate might be such that you're not listened to, but it is available, and when somebody wants to do it, you can make it easier to happen, so you still have an effect over time. And as you say, those sleeper effects are. I was listening on the radio last night, and it was about cervical cancer, and it was about the virus which leads to cervical cancer, and they were asking, why is there a second peak in women in getting cervical cancer in their 60s and 70s? And the argument was that basically about 80% of women have got the virus, right? But the immune system is strong enough to suppress it, okay? As you get older, your immune system weakens, and one argument is that the virus then emerges. Well, I think there's a similar process going on often in our work, that we put something in, and politics will suppress it for a while. But it's like the Scottish weather. If you wait long enough, things will change. If you wait 10 minutes, things will change. And actually what you say might have effects, which is why you shouldn't give up too easily. I think that's really important.
Do you experience, I'm interested when you're talking to politicians about policy issues. I mean, I don't talk to such people generally in my line, but I talk to other people as well out there where I'm sort of conscious sometimes of the same thing, which is the case of politicians. Very few of them seem to have science degrees generally. Their education has been in the art and humanities and so on. So not only have you got to get over your scientific point, as you go, you've got to maybe almost scientifically educate them, or at least deal with someone who doesn't really have that way of looking at the world. In terms of what's evidence-based. I mean, is that something you experience? I sometimes find that with media people, so we get approached and say, we're going to make a programme about ape behaviour. And I say, so, effectively, what do you know about ape behaviour? Well, nothing, that's why I'm phoning you up, Whereas then you'll get other people from the science unit or the naturalist unit who do know, so they come in different categories. But there's that kind of overarching problem you've got in, people's worldview that you're really dealing with. Yeah,
sometimes I'm not sure. I mean, part of it is a worldview, and it's sort of just understanding the concept. Sometimes it's language, and sometimes we use a language that I don't think communicates that well. And so I think the skill of actually being able to communicate things in a language that is comprehensible to people. One of the best things that ever happened to I say us because a lot of the work I've talked about I've done with colleagues, specifically Alex Haslam, and we got involved with Scientific American Mind, which I don't know if you've come across, I think it's very good. It sort of summarizes state-of-the-art research, but it does it for a broad audience. And when you work with Scientific American Mind, what they do is you write an article, then you work with a good science journalist, very good science journalist, and they help you to rephrase it. And I think it's improved my writing so much to be able to get over what I think are the core concepts without simplifying them, but in a way that clarifies. Clarification and simplification we often conflate, and they're not one and the same thing. And it comes back to the point I was making sort of earlier, that to me often it's harder to have the clarity to write for a general audience. It's like the old story that actually it's what's the anecdote? Mark Twain. Okay, I like this anecdote. Mark Twain was once asked to write an article of 300 words in 3 days. And he said, 3 days, 3,000 words. 300 words, 30 days. Okay? And his point was, it's often harder to be brief and cut to the analytic core than it is to write long articles. In the same way, to write something simple often demands greater conceptual clarity. So I think there is a demand, and I think it's an issue of practice, and I think it's an issue of language. I'm not sure it is a matter they can't understand if you express it. And one of the dangers, obviously, is if you attribute it to their lack, stops you making the effort and saying, actually, no, the lack is in me. And we should start by saying the lack is in us, and let's see what we can do to communicate better. That's my starting point.
But what about, because the research, that's been one of the essay questions for the fourth year reviews now, is that research gets misunderstood and misinterpreted in quite horrible ways all the time. So do you think that researchers have a responsibility to make sure that their science is interpreted in the media or in society in a correct way, or is that someone else's responsibility?
Gosh, those are huge theoretical. There are huge theoretical debates about, is the meaning of the text in the text or in the reader or whatever. If you do literary studies, you're aware of that. I think, take as an example. Does anybody remember the recent controversy involving Hilary Mantel, when what she said about our Kate? I should say our Kate. How dare she insult our Kate? And her point was, she was saying precisely the opposite. Right? That what she was talking about was the way that Kate is represented by the media, and actually she was defending the royals about misrepresentation by the media. Now the question is, was she just a victim of the media? And sometimes, actually, if you attack the media are going to misrepresent you. You know, sometimes there's just ill will. They don't misunderstand. They just want to get at you. Another example I thought was rather interesting recently. In the Eastleigh by-election, John O'Farrell was the Labour candidate. Now, I don't know if anybody knows, but John O'Farrell wrote some very funny books about politics in the 80s. In one of them, I mean, he's a student, he said, you know, when there was a bomb in Brighton and Thatcher nearly died, for a moment, I thought, oh, it's a pity she hasn't been killed. And then he realised that was an appalling thing. But, you know, the headline of the Daily Mail and of the local paper was, the most evil man in Britain supports terrorists, wants Thatcher to be there. If the media want to misrepresent you and are motivated to do it, you haven't got a bloody chance in hell. They will do it. At the same time, there are ways of writing which lend themselves to misrepresentation. Okay? And one of the things is, again, to be clear about what you're communicating to whom. I think when we do scientific writing, a lot of the time, we write as if we don't have our audience in mind. Right? So what are you trying to tell to them, and how much are you trying to tell them? If you're trying to tell them too much, it's quite easy for them to get hold of the wrong end of the stick. So again, sometimes it's motivation. And actually, I think I don't know what you feel, but in some of the assessments we're now doing within the school, there are increasing numbers of assessments which say summarise this for a general audience, or is anybody here from the second year? Any second years here? One of the second year tutorial tasks was to say, here is this paper, imagine you were telling teachers how to change their practice because of it. What would you write? I think things of that sort are actually intellectually and academically important. So actually these issues have implications for the syllabus and our assessments and so on. So as I say, nothing's an absolute panacea. You can be misrepresented, but we can make it harder for ourselves to be misrepresented.
When we look at after journals, scientific journals and so on, they have the impact factor, and I've been told by Dr. O'Connor that you have to give an impact statement when you apply for grants and so on. What do you think about how impact is measured? Is there a sensible way of doing it, or shouldn't it be measured at all, or is it necessary to measure it to begin with?
How long have you got?
Well, one thing I should just first of all say, you mentioned impact in two rather different senses, actually. So you talked about the impact factor of a journal.
Yeah.
And what that is actually saying is, you know, how much is it going to be cited? I mean, that's your measure ultimately. When you go into a website, you see that citation, you know, number of citations. How much is it going to be cited? So that's still, if you like, within the ivory tower. That's the academic measure of impact. And what's now happening in this Research Excellence Framework, REF, which I'm sure you students have all heard about, which comes to an end of the particular 5 years, is it 5, 6, 7, 8 years or something, 2008 to 2013, you know, comes to an end this year, where we're going to be assessed in terms of our academic excellence. Each school is going to be assessed in that way. 25% of the assessment now is going to look at impact, and it's not looking at that impact. You know, that's within the 75%, which is kind of pure academic side of it, and it's how much impact there is beyond that. And that's some of the things we were hearing about this morning. So, you know, for example, does Steve's work have impact? In fact, we've each got to do these impact statements, and one might be about your research, one might be about the public engagement work I talked about. That's the more dodgy one, because for various reasons, what you've got to show is the link, the causal link between the research you do and what the impact is. And, you know, in my case, that was the example I was giving there. So, you know, we did all this scientific research, it was published in really good journals. But then how do you show that that's actually affecting the public engagement? Well, we can say we've built it in, there's our panpipes, you know, that's based on the papers. People come, they're interested, they spend longer if we're doing that. You know, it's quite a detailed case you've got to build up. And as scientists, I mean, I would say I'm very sceptical. I think lots of other people are of the whole this whole idea of impact, because as scientists we know, in order to really show that, you'd have to do a much more controlled experiment. So for any study we do, to actually track the impact of it in the wider world, you need 3 other studies to do that. So what they're asking for is case studies in which you kind of make a case for it and try and convince people. So anyway, that was almost just a clarification point to say there are these 2 centres of impact, and because the ideal for us would be when the 2 things actually come together, and you're having, which I hope is the case in ours, so our knowledge base is very highly cited in the academic literature, but then we're also taking it out into the wider world, and so you're trying to tick those boxes. Well, I think quite a lot of people working in science feel it's a bit insidious. We're now asked not only to think about what the impact's going to be that's going to be relevant for the ref, but when you apply for a grant now, again, there's another kind of impact statement, typically for Research Council grant, where you're asked to kind of predict what the impact's going to be. And again, that seems, as you stand back and look at the reality of that, I mean, internally I want to say, I don't know, I wish I knew. I'm just going to try and do some good research, harking back to some of the themes this morning, and then there might be all kinds, I don't even know what the results are going to be. Some experiments are going to work, some are not. Halfway through I'm going to redesign the whole thing, come up with better experiments, and then there'll be some results. And with luck it might have various kind of impacts, but we're increasingly being asked to do that. And in fact there's a bunch of Nobel Prize winners who've written repeated letters to the Times and politicians and so on to say, this is a big mistake, this is not the way to take British science. You're not going to win the Nobel Prizes now if you stop people just doing what Keith sort of started off talking about. Be inquisitive. That's what basic pure science is about. That's what people get Nobel Prizes for. They're predicting that that's going to happen less. So there's huge controversies around, I think, in the scientific world over this. I'm just kind of rambling around your question, really, but I'll shut up.
I think that's the biggest question. The biggest question in all of academia are these issues. And I suppose one of the things is what are universities about? What are universities for? And what can universities do that, for instance, business and companies, research and development can't do? Well, research and development in business is subject to 2 things. A, it wants to make more profit for that company rather than for everybody. Right? And number 2, it's the timescale thing again. It wants a result that's going to increase your balance in the nearish future. Universities, I think, do 2 things that are distinctive. One is they have a longer timescale. Right? We can say what counts is not 5, 10 years down the road, but in 50 years or 100 years, who will ever remember anything you've done? And therefore, we have got to have the confidence to go down alleys without thinking that if that's a blind alley, I'm dead in the water. And that's I think the most important thing is that you give people the drive to move forward, but equally the courage to explore, different ways. And if you introduce too much short-termism, then the problem is that people will play safe. Now, even things like impact measured by how many people cite your work, you will get cited more if you're in a popular area saying something which is sufficiently popular that people are interested, but a bit different so it moves things forward. You won't get cited, at least in the short term, if you do something which opens something up, which is truly novel. Down the line you will, but it's short-termism which is incredibly dangerous in metrics. It's short-termism which is incredibly dangerous also in the notion of impact. So for me, actually, at one level, I have no problem at all with the notion of impact. I think in one sense or another, all of us are interested in impact. Whether it's changing understanding, whether it's affecting the world, it's how you define impact. And if you define impact too narrowly, and to say with too short a timescale of 5 years, it's a very short timescale, that's when you have difficulty. So I don't have a problem on a grant to be asked to consider precisely these questions of who might I engage with. It's the question of, if I want this research to have an impact, let me think about who I might want to engage with rather than wait for them to come to me. But to make it too mechanical and to interpret it in too narrow a way, I think then introduces that short-termism, which is the death of the very thing that we're supposed to provide. So, depending on how you define impact, it can be the best of worlds or the worst of worlds.
Good news is that generally the people who are refereeing these research
Yeah.
proposals and actually sitting on the committees deciding are us.
Yeah.
Not on our own grounds, but we're the same community, you know, with the same kind of beliefs, I suppose, if you like, that Steve and I have just been.
Yeah. Verity is on the psychology ref panel, for instance. So we're in safe hands. When you, I mean, I'm sure you've had this. I mean, Keith talked about, his dad, and I always had this. My parents would say, "What have you learned?" They'd say, "We're spending our money on that." And now, I mean, you probably missed it, but now students are paying, £9,000 a year, and I'm sure parents say, "What am I getting for my money?" I mean, what do you say to them when you want to explain why what you're doing is worthwhile or useful or valuable? Why do you think? I mean, when you answer that question, I'm sure you do one way or another. Why does what we're doing matter for you? We've said what we think, but what do you think?
Well, there's one thing, because now being in the position where you have to sit and answer questions, so why does your degree help you in this job that you have now applied for? And it's really easy when you sit there and I have brilliant skills in writing and communicating and I can summarize complex material and blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, at least and I think I speak for more people as well, is that the reason we do psychology is because it's really interesting. The brain is fascinating and humans are fascinating. But
well, some humans.
yes, I mean, but and that's maybe the same thing as applied and pure, if you want to talk in dichotomies, is that you do something because you're really interested and then you get good things along the way with it. At least that's my thing. I don't know. Any other fourth year one too?
Well, I think people are always really disappointed when you tell them you study psychology and then they learn that, you can't read their minds and they don't know very much about Freud. But
Another thing always to do is to actually say, "Yes, I can, tell me your dreams." And the thing to remember about dreams is a thing's a phallic symbol if it's longer than it's wide. those two messages you can interpret any dream you want. Are you disappointed? I mean, when I did my undergraduate degree, quite a few people felt, well, actually they were disillusioned. They felt, actually, I'm not very impressed. Where some people are remarkably enthusiastic. Do you feel it matters? Are you disillusioned? And if you do feel it matters, what has convinced you?
I think like one of the sort of most impactful things for me was just to learn to question sort of common sense psychology. So you think things are a certain way and everyone does that, but just to realize, that you can question that and it doesn't have to be that way. Like with Verity in her module, we're talking about the over-justification effect. I think that's totally counterintuitive, the idea that you don't need to reward things, and sometimes it doesn't help to reward things. And I think these things you don't just stumble across.
Right.
Yeah, I definitely think that kind of doing this means that when things are misrepresented in the media, you are more likely to say that's misrepresented and more likely to look for what the actual evidence for such and such a thing is or whatever. It gives you a sort of questioning and a kind of deeper understanding of general things as well. You're kind of in this mindset of questioning what is presented to you.
How many of you have parents or aunts or uncles that sort of point out to you newspaper clippings and things where they say, "Oh, they've just cured Alzheimer's disease," or so on? Does that make you realize just how different you are? Could you imagine how the world would be if everyone just accepted those sort of articles and just kind of went with them rather than questioning their basis? I mean, do any of you kind of find it a little bit embarrassing sometimes? Because my father used to do that to me. He used to say, "No, you don't understand. It's not like that."
I don't think I find it so much embarrassing as really frustrating, because like my dad argues that there's as much evidence for climate change as against climate change, you know. And I've tried, and I have to give up. And I think, you know, I'm failing as a researcher, even though it's not my field. The fact that I can't persuade somebody that actually it's not quite as clear cut as the Daily Mail makes it look. You know, there are equal numbers of scientists on both sides of the fence. So I think, yeah, I don't find it embarrassing. I find it frustrating, and I think that makes me feel quite concerned, you know, that there's a university educated person who holds that sort of view about science and isn't necessarily aware of, you know, the amount of money that's going into, you know, dissing the climate change science and so on. So I think that, yeah, I get sort of disillusioned about the Herculean task of persuading Daily Mail readers, you know, of the real science underlying some of the
Who
things.
is the Daily Mail?
Sorry,
Yeah. No.
sort of a stereotypes.
No, I mean, although one of the interesting things I think is, I mean, again, to be self-critical, every empire falls through hubris, okay, through overextending itself and overclaiming. One of the problems I think at the moment is there is an incentive to overclaim, right? In terms of getting grants, in terms of getting awards. For a while, I sat on a body which was electing fellows of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And so I would read these things, and the panel that I was on, I think Andy might have done it as well, it includes medicine. Well, every third person had cured cancer. I mean, I wondered why anybody dies of cancer, given that all these people had cured it, you know, 23, and Alzheimer's, and heart attacks, you know, nobody should ever die if you take these things seriously. So sometimes I think we have a tendency to to overclaim a little bit ourselves. And the other thing which I think is interesting, and again I think it's a dilemma, it's a question, about, especially with the media and with engagement, one of the things one learns very quickly is that journalists are lazy. Or if they're not lazy, they work to very tight deadlines. They've got to get an article by tomorrow. Okay? So if they talk to you about something, if they know you, you've talked to them about your subject, okay? They then have another topic, right? And they phone you up and they say, can you tell me about this? And you say, no, that's not my area. And they say, oh, go on, please, I've got to write something by tomorrow. And they're very skilled at drawing you into things. So you will get, I mean, if we all listed the things we've turned down, you know, I remember recently somebody phoned me, it's National Tie Week. Can you tell me about the psychology of wearing ties? And it's actually quite hard to say no. And I do think there's a real danger that, to me, before you talk to the media, you've got to say to yourself, what can I say, right, which an ordinary member of the public couldn't say? On what grounds do I have a warrant, because of my academic position, to be able to make, you know, more claims? And if you don't, you shouldn't say anything. But it's difficult. It's really difficult. So often, actually, we are discredited because we talk about stuff where we are just talking, actually often not even common sense. I often thought that if you ask people, where is the one place in the media, in the popular media, right, that you will come across psychology, well, quite frankly, it was Big Brother. Yeah. That's where you got psychologists. That's probably where most of the population saw psychology. And I do remember years ago, after we did the study on the prison study, it'd been on TV, and so we got phoned up by the Big Brother people saying, would you go on Big Brother and be one of the people who talks? And my niece begged me, because she thought it'd be really cool if I was on it. My uncle's a Big Brother, and my wife said she'd leave me if I did it, quite sensibly. But again, actually, I think that does incredible harm to psychology, because, you know, people then start thinking of psychology in terms of, you know, you can tell by the fact that he fancies her. Well, of course he did. He snogged her 2 minutes ago. I mean, it's bloody obvious. So sometimes I think, actually, we are responsible, and knowing when to engage more is important, but actually knowing when to engage less is equally important. And the barriers, especially since the media can be very seductive, they're very good at flattering you, they're very good at inveigling you into doing things you don't want to. I think that's quite an issue. So again, misrepresentation, yes, the problem lies elsewhere, but sometimes the problem lies with us as well, a little bit, I think. I think probably all of us have got at least one occasion where we think, I shouldn't have given that interview.
I'm wondering how you deal with getting negative results out, just in kind of either the public or within academia. because it seems that nobody's that interested in negative results, or there seems to be at least talk of how it's difficult to publish negative results.
I think that's a really good point, really important point. And it's not just about the media, because a lot of people have become increasingly concerned with what you call the file drawer phenomenon, that you have all the studies that didn't work, and so you then systematically misrepresent things by only publishing certain things. Also, replications aren't valued, and so in the same way, you have one study, but we don't tend to replicate in quite the same way, and that can lead to major distortions. So there's a bit of soul searching going on at the moment, partly because there have been one or two fraud cases in psychology, and that has led to a crisis of confidence, which has led people to raise questions about our methods. Now, as always, actually the problem doesn't lie with the fraudsters. There are very few of those. Quite frankly, there might be some, but they're the minority. The real problem are the generic practices which introduce bias into the discipline, and one of those is precisely, quite often what happens is a null result is called a pilot.
I've had some contact with the pharmaceutical companies, and it's moving to the point now where everything they do is going to have to be made transparently available, and that I think will be a good thing. Because suddenly you'll start seeing that they will often run studies over and over again until they get the positive result. But the other thing that's a little bit difficult is many people don't understand. So if you use animals, for instance, there's an ethical cost of using the animals. So if you replicate with animals, that's seen as being duplicative, not replication, but duplication, and that's illegal. But actually, replicating experiments is far more efficient than doing a big experiment with a huge number of animals to get statistical power. It's actually better to do smaller experiments repeated than that. And it turns out that industry has kept track the pharmaceutical industry has kept track of experiments done in academia, and something like 70% of the studies don't replicate when they try to do them in-house. And I think part of that may be that what the companies are getting are the digested, only the positive results version. So now often when they contract out research, they don't tell you, but they contract out the same thing to another laboratory, and they'll often compare.
So what do you think about initiatives like, I don't know the name of it, but there's a new psychology journal that's been started that's supposed to publish anything that's scientifically rigorous, even if it's non-results, or just putting things, there are websites where you can replicate experiments and report it there, but it's not peer reviewed. Do you think that's a good initiative, or should it be done another way?
The government's going to require that everything that's done with funding is going to be made available in terms of data. So it won't be just your digestion of the results, but you're going to have to make the data available on a public website. So I think, one way or another that will come. And I think then the issue is going to be is how to usefully get to and analyze that information, because it's going to be, and you can imagine trying, my lab notebook or my data file structure versus Steve's versus, and it's going to be a nightmare. So there's going to have to be a lot of effort in thinking about how we document what we've done exactly for the public record.
In terms of philosophy of science, the notion of replication is one of the most complicated issues you can think of, because of course you can never do the same thing twice. There's the old, can you put your foot in the same river twice? Well, yes and no. Because it's the same river. So simply do the same study twice. Well, some factors are going to change. And when we write up our results, it's not that we're being dishonest. You write up the things that you think are relevant, and you leave out other things. In your work, the way you handled and trained and reared the animals might be different in different labs. In mine, the comments people made when they recruited people might be different. Now, sometimes science progresses precisely because you find different results and you think, actually, there was a difference that we didn't realise. Normally, you infer it from what's in the write-up. Okay? If you don't have access to that, it's very difficult to know what the fact is. So actually, the whole concept of replication is wrong, because there's no such thing as a replication. There's a replication of what conceptually we feel are the key elements of things, or which aren't. And often different labs have different practices, which they see as background practices, which they don't foreground, which cause those types of problems. So I'm all for logging things, okay? And I'm all for open access, but that's not going to solve the problem, because you can only write down the things that you think are relevant. There's no such thing as a total account of things. So we shouldn't believe that there are panaceas. It's still always going to be a conceptual issue of what we think is relevant, what we record, and therefore what we use to explain our results. And that's just the nature of knowledge that you can't get round.
I basically agree with what you've said, but what I was going to say in response to your question, it seems to me that there's kind of two levels to do with this issue of what about negative results. One is just the kind of fundamental scientific issue of kind of proving a negative result, if you like. I think, you know, if you do an experiment and you get a positive result, and you do a controlled experiment, I don't know, you're putting some drug in, or whatever it is, some alleged causal factor A causing B, you do the experiment, you get a positive result. Well, there can be artifacts producing that, but by and large, that's a typically more powerful situation than getting a negative result, which can often be explained by a whole host of factors that you didn't realise you weren't controlling. And that links with what Steve was saying, because, you know, each time you do it differently. So another lab's failed to replicate your result. That's because, oh, no, you didn't do the training in the right way, and so on. But when you get multiple labs confirming the result, then you get, you know, convergence on the truth, we hope, you know, so that, you know, the things that get into your textbooks, and, you know, you can cite all these different studies that have for decades sometimes actually confirm the result. That's different. So I think there's an inherent difference between positive and negative result. And I've heard some people say, I was at a conference recently where someone did talk of putting the negative result in the drawer, and there was an uproar, you know, I shouldn't do that, but he was saying, just leave it in the drawer, think about it for a while before you rush into print, because I can think, you know, there's these 2 or 3 problems with it. So there's that, but then there is the journal issue. So this is even before we get to the media. There's the journal issue that certainly almost the higher level the journal, the higher the impact factor, the less they're going to be prepared to publish something that isn't new. I mean, you know, by definition, you've got to have something novel to get into, quotes, the best journals, which is a real problem. And maybe a solution is the thing that you just mentioned, at least with the journals like Public Library of Science. I think, you know, profess now to be prepared. If it's good methods, good results, we're not going to worry about whether it's going to, you know, set the world on fire. We'll publish it. But that's refereed, so that's still good. To me, that's good. There are other journals, as you say, springing up that are now trying to fast track and express and saying, well, just print it, and then afterwards, you know, other people can test it and try it in different ways, and, you know, the truth will out eventually. That seems to be more dangerous and worrying, but it seems to be starting to happen. Because it's expensive to publish in Public Library of Science. You know, it's like $1,000 you need now to publish your paper. Not that you're giving the money, so they're paying them to publish it. It's refereed, but if it's accepted, you still got to pay for it. And now there are these cheaper options coming up. I think there's one that's like $90 or something, isn't it? And so, I don't know if that's the one you've heard of, which might not be refereed in that way, and so you're getting these different horses in the race now.
And there are also these, dare I say it, scam journals that will publish just anything for a fee, and it's a bit vexed in some forms of research. So if you publish something in regard to maybe pharmaceuticals, there are laws in some countries that if you pay to publish an article, you have to label it as an advertisement. If you're using some sort of new drug. And there's it gets incredibly complex.
I mean, on peer review, it's a bit like juries, okay? You can show all the biases there are in juries. You could spend a week pointing to all the biases there are in juries. But the only thing you can say in the end is the only thing worse than a jury is not having a jury. Now, in the same way, peer review is open to innumerable biases. You know perfectly well, as an editor, that you could get a journal, an article accepted or not accepted as a function of who you send it to. Okay, there are terrible biases in it. But the only thing worse than peer review is no peer review. Because, for instance, especially in an increasingly technical discipline, right? I know some statistics, I don't know other statistics. I need to know, when I look at an article, that the analysis is sound and that it's been reviewed by somebody who knows what they're talking about in those grounds. If you just put everything out there, you'd have a real problem of then assessing what is nonsense and what isn't nonsense, because it's not always quite transparent. So I must admit, the notion of putting everything up there, and it's a bit like the arguments about about the internet and the fact that all sources are equivalent. Well, not all sources are equivalent. Some sources have more knowledge, some sources are more excellent, and to deny that isn't elitist, I don't think. To deny that is actually to have notions of, of due process, of rigor, and so on. So I must admit, I'd be a bit nervous of the notion that you create a system where everything is treated as equivalent, and we're given all this information, and actually we're left in a position where we don't know how to distinguish between it.
One thing I've been wondering is how, if you use such things as, like, there's this website called, I think, the Open Data Forum, that tries to encourage scientists to put up, every step of their experiment so that everyone can see it and everyone can share that. But how can you actually reinforce that someone puts up everything and not, again, like a slightly brushed up version of what they did? I don't know how that could be done unless you install cameras everywhere.
There are,
even with cameras.
there are these things called electronic lab notebooks for the more sort of biological end of things, where you enter in data as it's collected, and then it's sent off to a server where that's time stamped, and then a backup of that is put on a DVD, and someone signs the DVD every day. So that's the way the drug companies do it. So they once the data is collected, it's taken off to a physically separate site that the people collecting the data don't have. And then there's actual, there's a physical thing that's actually signed by human beings saying that this was collected on such and such a day. That's an incredibly difficult system to use. I hope we in academia don't have to do that, but the drug companies do that because of the licensing laws.
Has anybody ever read the novel Tristram Shandy? Does anybody know Tristram Shandy? It's a fantastic novel. Apparently it was Marx's favourite novel as well. And it's often called the first novel in the English language, written by Lawrence Sterne in the 18th century. And it's an account of the life and times of Tristram Shandy. And at the same time as being the first novel, it's quite surreal. I mean, it really is. It's sort of like modern sort of surreal humour, because what he does is he says, I'm going to tell you everything about Tristram Shandy. And he starts at the point of his conception. But to explain the conception, he has to explain why the parents got there, and he has to explain what led to the parents getting to the position where they get. And after about 700 pages and 20 odd books, he ends up 10 years before the conception, and this is a book about the life and times of Tristram Shandy. And his point, right, in the first novel, the first account seemingly of someone's life, is you cannot give a full description. It's just actually impossible, and the more you try and do it, the more you get led away from what you're trying to describe. So that takes me back to the point I was trying to make before. I'm all for all this recording, but you can only record what you think is relevant. You can't record everything. Even with cameras, cameras have a particular perspective, a particular view. There's a point where you turn them on, there's a point where you turn them off. There is no God's eye view of everything. The illusion of a God's eye perspective is precisely what most social thought for the last 40 years or so has been trying to contest. So, as I say, the danger is if you think these things are a panacea, if you think these things solve the problem, and in the end you move forward by good conceptual analysis, which leads you to say that might have been relevant and we forgot about it, and we didn't record it. So often the most relevant stuff is the stuff you don't record because you can't know whether it's relevant or not.
And of course, the more you record, the more you have a problem with making sense of the data once it's recorded.
Yeah.
I mean, what's the purpose of it if it's...
Absolutely, you don't have time to look at it.
Any last thoughts before we clear out for the history department to take over?
I was just interested in what you said about the major challenges facing society, and the fact that it's interesting that psychology has something to say about many of those, and yet all of the money and all the investment is going into other areas. And I suppose I've almost answered or given part of the picture in saying what the money is going into, because I think, like in public health, there's obviously money for pharmaceutical companies, and there isn't money for them in, developing better communities, or, sort of more low-key, non-technical or non-pharma solutions to public health problems. Do you have any other thoughts about what else is going on there, apart from, advanced capitalism having huge investment in products?
I don't know.
And what psychologists might be able to do, because I think you are, uniquely able to comment on some of these kind of challenges as psychologists, and yet, as you say, often out of the picture.
You'll remember a number of years ago when the discussions were going on about what the medical school in St Andrews will be like, and the idea was there would be links to biology, links to human sciences, geography and psychology, and links to, physics. So there were these 3 poles, and there was a big meeting, which was organised by the last principal, and they brought in 2 assessors. These assessors were wonderful. I don't know if you remember those old Doctor films, but they were the Dean of the Medical School of St Mary's, Sir Huffington Winterbottom. These very important medical men, wearing very, very impressive tweed suits. And I remember starting by making the point that I made, which is actually when you look at human health, most of the major changes, antibiotics, a very good example of an exception, but most of it is behavioural. And they looked daggers at me. They couldn't deny it, but you could tell them. And then somebody was talking about really very impressive sort of biomedical advances, but actually which were less significant. It was clear that's where the status was, because there was an internal sense of, but that's sophisticated and you're somehow softer. It's the representation of psychology, I think, is really interesting and really problematic. So at one end, it's not seen as scientific enough and hard enough and giving enough status because it's not technological enough. On the other hand, it's seen as Big Brother. On the other hand, it's seen as, I think the representation of our discipline is something we should be really concerned with, and the strategies of dealing with it. I don't have a magic wand, but certainly I think it's something we need to attend to. But even in our own institution, right, where it wasn't so much a matter of the big bucks, it was a matter of what do we reward, what is status, what is important, and therefore what do we put the resources into. It was a stunning example that nobody denied the argument that this is where things count, but that's not where we're going to get the recognition. This was soft in some way. So again, in part, it's internal, and I think it's quite tangible. And I mean, Andy makes a very good point that lots of things that happen to us we do to ourselves. We hand out the grants to ourselves. We say what is good and bad research, but sometimes that means that we are responsible for the biases that we like to rail against in terms of what gets the funding, what doesn't get the funding, and so on.
Because we have to survive in that setting.
Partly. Well, it's also because of the way in which our internal sets of values and standards introduce a bias. What is high status in academia? Right? What will get you the plaudits?
Yeah, it's journal papers and things, isn't it? It's not talking to the public.
Well, even in journal, again, it seems to me that something behavioural as opposed to something very. Again, in psychology, just to take one example, the notion of science. Well, my sense is actually we're all scientists. But the point is that your methods have got to be appropriate to your object of study, and the way you, for instance, might investigate a neural system is different from examining the process of sense-making at a different level, right? But we tend to reify particular ways of doing as the true thing, and they're having more status. So actually it's this type of research with these types of techniques is higher status than that. These notions of hard and soft. On a more optimistic note, right? And if only we could turn things round. I remember many years ago watching one of these TV programs with Stephen Hawking on it, right? And Stephen Hawking, of course, is our image of the scientist. He's the latter-day Einstein. He's the image of what is good science. And it's one of these programs where he's standing against 3 blackboards full of equations, you know, Mr. Big Brain. You know, that's a classic representation of something really clever. And he's talking about, you know, the shape of the universe. And they ask him, they say to him, well, Professor, what will you do when you have actually finally discovered the nature and the shape of the universe? And he said, no, he said, I'll do something really difficult, he said, like human psychology. Actually, we are an object that's incredibly slippery to study, partly because we are reflexive beings. As soon as we create an understanding of who we are, it enters into our own behavior, it changes who we are, like a piece of soap to study. That's the challenge is so great. So the notion of what is good science, and the notion of what sort of work and what sort of methods and so on make good science, I think are skewed in a way that sometimes they get in the way of what we do. And as I say, I think we're partly responsible for that ourselves.
Right, I think that's quite a good time to stop, actually. Thank you, everyone. It's been really interesting. Thank you, everyone, for agreeing to help, and thank you for organising this.
Well, thank you as well. Thank you. Let's all thank each other. We're all wonderful human beings. And thank you, Brian, for videoing us.
Yes, thank you.